I am resident of Collinwood for YouTube, here to continue my read along for the Dark Shadows Daybook UnBound, Chapter 5, 1970. Dark Night of the Soul. Night has fallen over the great house of Collinwood. We left the 20th century with the moon landing on the horizon, and although J.F. Kennedy, his brother, and Martin Luther King had been taken from us, that achievement was going to be a far greater testament to human greatness. And then the Manson murders. It's no surprise that our next adventure plunges its golden boy into hell and ends up endangering the entire family with a cult led by a charismatic 20 something who makes most of the characters over 30 seem untrustworthy as they try to win his approval. It's easy to look at Star Trek and see the 1960s. It's a little harder with Dark Shadows, which is ironic since it actually takes place in the 1960s. Sometimes Dark Shadows was seemingly concerned with reprocessing boring classics, so we didn't have to read them and pretend they were as much fun as a Remo Williams novel. However, the events of their era could not help but find their way into the stories. Nowhere is it more evident than here. Episode 933. Quentin and Amanda have crossed the decades to reunite. But can they cross hell itself? Amanda, Donna McKinney, McKenzie, sorry. Quentin and Amanda navigate through hell, never allowed to touch as they prove their love through twisted ankles and giant spiders. Paul Stoddard sits in a fox fugue at Cheese-Stokes until he encounters his doom at the hands of the prime Leviathan in the professor's rumpus room. As he dies, Amanda seemingly pitches over a bridge in the underworld. While 933 wouldn't air for 3 weeks or so into January, it was still the first episode shot as a new decade began. Violet Wells, who often referred during plot arc exploration with Russell and Hall, shows the wit and gravitas of the best of those two writers. And this installment is a grand example. The show was standing atop the magical year of 1969. This was in many ways one of the last hurrahs of the intense madhouse of creativity and fun that began with Barnabas's mercy mission to 1796 and ended with the rise of the Leviathans. With the 1897 spin-off in between, was 933 seen as a beginning or an end? It was both and neither. A film was in the works, and I suspect that parallel time was being talked about. They had freedom to jettison two great characters because so much was possible. But to see them both, well, almost both, go in one installment is a brash choice. Nonetheless, Paul Stoddard, the most important non-character of the series, barely establishes himself before serving as one of the cruelest sacrifices to the Leviathans. Wasteful? Perhaps, but I see it as a gutsy statement of where the show was willing to take audiences. If they can kill the entire reason the house was a crypt in the first place, nothing was too precious to be above becoming canon and canon fodder. There is a lot of new upon our return from 1897, and killing Paul Stoddard both recenters the story on essential characters and re-emerging heroic Barnabas, and opens up room for the character of Jeb. The Dark Shadows canvas may be broad, but it still benefits from a tad of elegance. The reappearance of Amanda Harris can be seen as a non sequential given how little impact it ultimately has on the story. They may have had bigger plans for the character. It feels that way. Donna McKinney certainly has breathtaking beauty and integrity. Like a brilliantly fusion of Catherine Lee Scott and Alexandra Moltke, never let it be said that Dan Curtis didn't have a type. I can see the reluctance to jettison her as an actress, however. Stephen Sodom's landmark musical Company would open in late April, and McKinney was a key player. Doing both could not be an option, and so Amanda had to go. I'm not sure anyone on the show ever received as mythical a send off. Cy Thomasoff must be congratulated. Building all of Collinsport in something the size and width of a small bowling alley was tough enough. Putting in what at least appeared to be multiple levels of hell, a chasm into an abyss, and the pit of a giant spider. Also, it's a creative masterstroke by the entire production team. Is it Hollywood? No, but you focus on that kind of realism, it's like getting a box of donuts and only seeing holes. They took a world hand reigning over the kitchen table and put the pits of Hades in its place. Both David Selby and Donna McKinney are key to selling the dramatic truth of the show's wildest setting. And their trip through the underworld is an example of the program's creative ambition and generosity toward the audience. I can only imagine being a kid and connecting the dots. The program's been dabbling with a hellish subdimension for some time. How close were they to Diablos' office? Could they have wandered in? Was the interior of the Leviathan altar overhead? Was it hollow inside? Were there bat poles? How closely connected could these things have been? And did they stand a chance of bumping into the transformed Jeb? Shambling toward Professor Stokes' place through the servants' corridors, how did Nicholas keep that tan down there? Because it was a good one. The flames were really hot. That was good. Yeah, he did have a tan. Not too long to think about it. The show typically moves sequentially in the episodes, but when in what feels like a warm up of cinematic storytelling, 933 employees cross cutting between two concurrent narratives, and does it some sophisticated job at letting each build the tension of the other. The mini climaxes and often literal cliffhangers have a precision that Hollywood often lacks. The Last Jedi comes to mind as a film that mangled the same attempt. But let's face it, the Walt Disney Company is no Dan Curtis production. That's true. That's true. I mean it. This episode was broadcast January 21st, 1970. Episode 936. Carolyn goes from funeral to fun when her eulogy attracts the most eligible bachelor in Collinsport, Jeb Christopher Pennock. Paul is dead. Jeb is born. Roger is antsy, and Barnabas isn't feeling too well himself. Why, Barnabas? Why did they choose him? I'm sure there's a more literal explanation, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that he was on TV, and that's free publicity. Snake cults don't run on love and good intentions. I assume Barnabas' propensity for immortality is what led him to manage the Leviathan project. Oberon and Haza probably mentioned something else from his resume at the interview. They should have negotiated with Mr. Best, and Quentin transferred from his job cutting lemons Hat at the High Hat Lounge. Yeah, neither Barnabas nor Quentin shows a lot of management potential, but Quentin routinely caters Jeb's lunch with his fist. They could have actually held Amanda Harris hostage, threatening a further extreme couvre. Josette was only good until a seance would come along. Given that it's Collinsport, a seance is pretty much guaranteed with greater promptness and regularity than the bus to Logansport. But Barnabas is their guy. Right now, it's like he got drunk and joined the Shriners without realizing what a demand it would place on his schedule. Barnabas comes off like a mid century Catholic school administrator who's been to a post Vatican educational convention and has to tell the brothers to stick to timeouts instead of running them down with Buicks as prescribed in the book of Leviathan. Oh, good. David, even hypnotized, David needs discipline, but Jeb's going a tad far. Bill Malloy would probably just have halted the boy, but ocean travel mellows a man. In all seriousness, if Jeb's attack on David does anything, it allows Barnabas to display his sense of decency and the outrageous attack. Now that Jeb is aboard, Barnabas no longer has to be sub as the villain, and he makes up for it in this episode, putting out fires where he can. Neither of the Collinwood 1701D staff, David and Carolyn, have an easy time of it in this one. Carolyn now permanently thinks of her better qualities as stottering, and I can't blame her. David's no doubt looking into restaurant management opportunities in Panama. Although I imagine pedestrian dangers are even more severe than in Collinsport, Roger suspects foul play, but number one dad may be too late on that one. Overall, it's a bad day for parenting at Collinwood. When Roger is the responsible one, Liz is too busy pouring herself a congratulatory campery and you for attending a funeral that's not hers. Parenting has always been problematically domestic, sorry, demonstrated at Collinwood, and the rest of the series evidence that has Liz and Roger becoming increasingly distant. Excluding a few warm moments coming up, this sequence is a turning point in the kids' erosion of trust in their parents. Of course, the story is shifting violently towards Barnabas' journey rather than domestic travels, so there's not as much time. But Carolyn and David will pay various prices when Gerard attacks. The show can only pretend that this is a loving home for so long. The absent parent is always the preferred one for the kids, even when they're trying to burn the kids alive. Dark Shadows has always been about sins of the past. With Laura gone, Roger steps up as much as he can, but that's limited by the fact that life at Collinwood got complicated when his ex-wife flamed on and grew stranger from there. I know this episode is about Carolyn, Jeb, and Carolyn and Jeb, and about Barnabas's futile attempts to unsmoke the cigarette of snake culture. But I'm wondering more and more, where is Roger Collins in this arc? He's taken into Quentin's confidence and fights on the team more than he ever has. But even as he abstinently participates, it's not to an impressive degree. But what's he going to do? Issue a caddy no? Again, perspective splits between production and story. As far as production is concerned, Roger's days as a villain are played out. He has a stay because of his plot function regarding David, and successfully mini heartthrob and story catalyst Roger and Liz almost make good civilians to remain vaguely threatened, vaguely unaware, and vaguely available to hear and deliver exposition. But with only plus minus 6 parts to spread around per episode, the increasingly supernatural ensemble edges out the more mortals. But within the Dark Shadows universe itself, what explains it, after you've seen your grandfather's brother come back from the grave and try to kill Burke Devlin's I mean your son, it's crossed. Guys, if you read the Dark Shadows Daybook, it says Burke Devlin, but Burke Devlin's crossed out. That's good. That's good. I like that. Your son, you don't have to touch that hot stove twice. Roger's participation dwindles drastically after early 1969 when Barnabas leaves for the 1890s. Gone on business for the beginning of the Leviathan arc, gone again for Gerard's haunting. In fact, Roger will not only be seen after episode 979 for the character. That's only 6 more episodes, and the show still has nearly a year and a quarter left. A key reason that Dark Shadows feels less and less like Dark Shadows. Right now, and onward, well, kitten, you're looking at it. Liz doesn't fare much better. She has fewer than 30 episodes left, although she is the first character we see at main time Collinwood and will be one of the very last. If the show, as we know it in 1198, feels like Dark Shadows in its final moments, that's it. Because we're influenced about what makes up the series, but when we enter it, for most of us, this makes the latter section of the show feel alien to us. This is purely subjective. Your start your viewing, and Roger and Liz are strangers on a series belonging to Julie and Barnabas. Those heads are the family are absent for nearly 20% of it. Nearly 25% if we discount the pre-Barnabas segment. That's transition is this transition is all the more dramatic as Christopher Pennock is finding the character he's discussed being uncertain about his sure footing as he began as Jeb. But the character is written with the same all caps with which he acts him, where he is subtly in bringing to life a primordial snake god man messiah, you tell me. Storm and Selby, the other high water marks on the haughty hunk scale, had the benefit of not speaking for the first months. So not only did they get comfortable with the ensemble, but their speaking roles were entirely new characters. Few have had to do so much so quickly, and Pennock acquits himself with high style. This episode was broadcast January 26, 1970. Christopher Pennock was, in the most marvel of manners, an ultimate being. He was impossible in every sense, impossibly talented, neurotic, loving, tempestuous, honest, intelligent, and necessarily profane. We lost him today. We had been he had been suffering for some time depending on his mood. Pennock might have joked that he had been suffering for his entire life. When he wasn't busy living it to a degree that would have shamed a marching band, the next hottie to find himself on a program after Jonathan Fred and David Selby, Pennock was no himbo. He kept himself honest and constant with a constant doubt. He was worried that his rough beginning as Jeb Hawks made for a poor introduction to the ensemble. In truth, he handled the awkward hipster snake god with a sincerity that encapsulated the idea of a dark messiah who was most eloquent than deep. It was the first of many parts that allowed him to contribute irony as well as integrity, beyond being a solid East Coast red meat performer worthy of his actor studio affiliation. Sorry. Pennock was an author, artist, and spiritual explorer who clearly saw the ludicrousness of what he was doing and committed it to full force. Perhaps somewhat because of it, he found the total joy of John Yeager's compass for evil. He loved Gabriel's sore wit and loved the character's tearful pique as he revealed his true motives to his father he murdered to the detriment of his career. Pennock's taste for the idiosyncratic made him impossible to injection mode as leading man. Number 7. But as the show entered its post 1897 malice, Pennock brightened every scene he was in with unique blend of commitment and knowing humor toward himself. He was newly brought he was only newly brought detached from the legacy of the show's early mythos, and he was here to make the most of it. And at its essence, theater is about the struggle to make necessary changes after learning uncomfortable truths. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Pennock, growing up resist, resist, resisting the repression of the East Coast bluest wasp blood, he has a much needed anarchist against rigid conformity from interviews. It's also clear that his anarchy was in the pursuit of something better. He was frank with us when the conch shell of the at Butter Pennock blew the claration raspberry. We heard of life's triumphs and tragedies with relentless candor on social media, often in secret code. I think my first interaction with him was over a stated intention to end it all. He had a flourishing dignity about it, and I couldn't bring myself to argue with him. What could you do later? I was lucky enough to participate in a dinner interview with him where he eagerly talked for hours about the end of the world, severe depression, and his post caudal encounter with a well meaning transvestite, and then finished it with finished it off with a staring contest for an audio podcast and he let me win. It was a great night. I was never more nervous nor more at ease. It's hard to imagine a festival without his Falstaffian presence. I'm not sure he's really gone from the mortal world in the same sense that I'm sure he was fully married by it. He had the unmistakable crackle of Bedhistaville as much as man, and the upcoming humor and affection that surrounded him at his best prove my point. In his passionate extreme, he achieved a wild and pained balance. If matters become too dour, an ironic observation would hit forth with a master's timing, and was just as capable of deeply human kindness and insight. He generally existed with one foot on earth and one foot someplace else entirely. Both places are the better because of it. Episode 941. Jeb's romantic evening with Carolyn is interrupted by the surprise appearance of Quentin's fist. But will Maggie pay the price? Quentin, David Selby. Quentin's rescue Quentin rescues Carolyn from Jeb with successful fisticuffs before Barnabas can whisk Carolyn away to seclusion and safety. Jeb kidnaps Maggie, suspecting that she is Barnabas's weakness. As Barnabas threatens to summon Oberon, Jeb laughs, knowing that Maggie is laid out in a mausoleum. There are a lot of audiences for the program, and between satisfying all of them, the show also has to be true to its own unique mythology. Dark Shadows is both all continually and flees from continuity whenever it can at this point. I don't think there's any greater corner into which they painted themselves than the one with mutton chops and a cool gray coat called Quentin. It's not just David who remembers him as a ghost. Liz does too. I like how they acknowledge that in this episode, and I also understand why they dropped it pretty quickly, or why the Collinses are a pretty forgiving, gullible family. The writers have to because it's a conversation that goes nowhere. The characters have to because they'd have no relatives otherwise. Mrs. Johnson has leftovers, and if another cousin from England doesn't show up pronto, that embroche salad will get to a point where even Willie wouldn't eat it after a bender at the Blue Whale. Quentin's reluctance to re-engage Liz is a character moment that you might miss if you blink, but it's enough to perform its function on the show. If it weren't for the Leviathan arc, they might be able to devote more screen time to Quentin's return by making it the sole story. But that might require bringing back a villain from 1897 like Patofe. And who wants to see that except everyone? However, that's running in place, and to the show's credit, they moved forward to book a third hottie on the program. It's not only kept the show fresh, it also, and I'm just theorizing this, kept Dan Curtis from being a victim to everyone's success. There has to be a line for a producer between working for ratings and working for the source of your ratings. Just as no one suspected that Barnabas would be such a hit, no one suspected that Quentin would either, and arguably to a greater merchandising degree, as much fun as 1969 was 1970, would be about topping it and retrending 1897 so soon with a path that wisely avoided and at a cost. Barnabas and Quentin are kept around because to not do so would have been suicide. But now often at the service of Chris Pennock and James Storm, the most strangely sexless arc is the one in between Jeb and Gerard. 1970, parallel time, in which there was no hottie. Yes, Quentin is dashing in a Ron Burgundy sense, but he's also a loudmouth, clueless, overacting bully. Cyrus might be sympathetic, but he's hardly an alpha, and Jaeger, the mustache and wig, don't have the gullet magic they might have hoped. Before any of that, 941 presents a moment of 1897 style action that is always a cherry in the show's fruit cocktail for me. The fight scene between Jeb and Quentin is a last hurrah that might as well have taken place in Cetus 3 so that the Metrons would release Collinwood from their grasp. Quentin introduces Jeb to his biscuit hooks in his best and most Quentin-esque modern costume, and the whole thing feels like a sly reassurance from Dan Curtis. The man can and will release the Kraken at the drop of a putter, so tune in. With enough patience, Dark Shadows is any show you need it to be. Soap opera, of course. Character farce when you least expect it. Musical, all they go there. Horror, you bet. Science fiction, the time travel and dimensional leaps qualify, and prime time action, that too. It may even have a dash of Brady Bunch. 1941 has a strangely and enduringly adolescent ending, as if they sensed what their prominent adolescent audience might do. Barnabas threatens to call Principal Oberon on Jeb, and Jeb responds by making fun of Barnabas for having a crush on Maggie. It's a strangely sweet and innocent ending for an episode that begins with, and let's take the schemata off it, Quentin preventing a rape. I don't know if that is supposed to be mentioned or not, but Jeb slips Carolyn a Mickey, and it's not for a good night's sleep. Now Dan's biggest problem is over, how he redeems the guy. I'm not sure he worries too much about it, or he lets the story take care of it. That and the culture of 1970, I'm not rushing to get out my hanky by watching it in 2019. I wonder if they'd introduce that character choice at all, or if they did, if Jeb would be seen as eventually redeemable in any way. It also helps to humanize Joan Bennett after her turn as a good, stoic, dedicated hostess to Leviathan functions. It would have been easy to turn her into Miss Johnny Eastling and fork her daughter over to the cult, but you don't come back from that choice. The characters might get their memories erased, but the audience doesn't. Wise to have her go along with Barnabas's plan to take her to an island, any island. There are a lot of audiences for Dark Shadows, but they all can agree on the basic right and wrong. This episode hit was broadcast February 2nd, 1970. Episode 955. When Angelique's latest husband tries to burn her alive, can she reunite with an old flame? Angelique Rumson, Laura Parker. After Sky tries to kill Angelique, she flees to the old house where Quentin takes her in. Sky's attempts at reconciliation are rebuffed. Meanwhile, Barnabas pursues Maggie and even gets her the fabled engagement ring, but Quentin stops him short of biting her. Angelique, seeing Maggie as her rival, as her fall in love with Quentin, just as she once had Josette fall in love with Jeremiah. Sometimes, which is most of the time, I just want to talk about why I love an episode. Dan Curtis had a famous dream about a girl on a train. I had a dream about an Angelique TV sitcom pilot. They both came true. I may like the Angelique plot more. With a series as sprawling as Dark Shadows, there are almost countless reasons for tuning in. If yours is Laura Parker, you've made an excellent choice. Beyond her obvious beauty, she fascinates due to her incredibly bright, sharp, poised presence. Her background, one part academia and one part fine Southern society, is one of our closest analogues to the world in which Angelique found her American footing. As with Jonathan Frid, wicked wit and advanced education and a respectable social background give her a sense of anachronistic exorcism and authority, unlike him. However, her roots trade is Ray detached Canadian sense of irony for the underlining fury passion so often associated with the American South. Put all of that together and you have Angelique. Moreover, you have an intensely watchable performance of a frequently re- repre- reprehensible character. Even when we don't like what she does to people, we like watching her do it. And few others could pull off such an entire intermittent evil and have us rooting for her anyway. When she's bad, It's for understandable reasons. When she's good, she's usually being evil anyway. And that's towards someone even worse. Again, for understandable reasons. For many, Dark Shadows is a TV series about Angelique. If we ever wanted to make it official, 955 is the pilot, lacking only an animated opening sequence, credit sequence in which she kisses Barnabas, wipes off his tie with saucy panache, and uses it to strangle a toy soldier while winking a huge kaleidoscope eye at the audience. This is pretty close. Beginning an episode with Felix being thrown into the streets of New York by his fed up wife is amusing. What's better? The Angelique series, meaning 955, begins with Sky Rumsey barging into her room with a torch saying, "And I kid you not, I wanted to work it out." Well, if you put it like that, from there, we see one satisfying scene after another fulfilling the Angelique Jones we ever we never really knew how or sorry, we never knew we had. Quentin even greets her with a bemused warmth set, aside for reuniting celebrity frenemies on the Jerry Lewis telethon. There's a kiss on the cheek. Of course, you can stay at the old house, and warm sympathy for her husband trying to burn her alive. What's most important is that moment of Quentin. I think I really did love the big lug all along, which is her kind of not coming to the same crucial realization that Barnabas will reach out in the future past of 1840. This reduces Quentin to mentally stammering like Hank Kimball on Green Acres because cue laugh track. He just saw Barnabas macking on Maggie, and successfully too, with Josette's ring. He's a vampire again, so he might as well drink the best. I mean, Joe Haskell's out of the picture. Victoria's out of the picture. What's touching in this is that Barnabas is pursuing Maggie, not Josette, but Maggie. And it's high time, naturally, if only Sky had tried to kill Angelique just a few hours earlier, she would have beaten Maggie to the punch. But then we wouldn't have the bittersweet makings of a supernatural farce. At least we get the relief of seeing her tell Sky to get lost. I've had plenty of moments of watching women knuckle under the two jerk boyfriends who do one horrible thing after another but always get taken back. It's nice to have one of them try it with Angelique. It's like another part of the pilot, but now the pilot has gone from the world of domestic comedy to the socially conscious era of Mary Tyler Moore. Only one more hurdle, Maggie, who's dressing like Rhoda more and more, but still stands in the way of Barnabas. You can hear the Jerns turn louder than number one at the Blue Whale. You know what? Wouldn't she and Quentin make a nice couple? Fans keep picturing them together. They're the Mary Ann and Professor of Collinsport. Let's give them what they want. The Devil's Brand makes its familiar return from 1795, and suddenly Quentin and Maggie are locking lips in a way that seems far more satisfying than the case of Josette and Jeremiah. Than the case, sorry. Barnabas only asked this one on a date. It's not like they are engaged. But if you're Angelique and if your only tool is a love spell, then every problem looks like Catherine Lee Scott. At least she picked a suitor who's bulletproof if it comes to a duel. Again, all that's left would be Angelique telling Barnabas that Maggie needs to see them kissing so that she'll get jealous and dump Quentin. It's for his own good. Angelique, it sounds crazy, but it just might work. It just might. Louis Edmonds turning into a cat tested well with audiences before. This episode was broadcast February 20th, 1970. Jeffrey Scott was a pitcher of stalwart. Dark Shadows was known for actors with myriad positive qualities. When considering the male leads to appear after Mitch Ryan, stalwart isn't always the first word to shuffle up on the Rolodex. Could David Selby, Roger Davis, and Joel Carruthers project the quality if called upon? Of course, blindfolded in their sleep, on an iced tightrope, in a hurricane, backward, with a drink in their hand, not spill a drop, they could be stalwart, with characteristic ease and truth. But Geoffrey Scott simply was. This was literally the Marlborough Man come to Collinsport. This was a man so tough that he went from having both legs crushed in a biking accident to resume a career as a virtual athletic screen presence. He topped by moving to the Rocky Mountain area because he enjoyed the skiing. If I discovered that he was powered by the rays of Earth's yellow sun far from his native Krypton, I wouldn't be surprised. He held his own against the Hulk and Margaret Hamilton at various points in his career, at, and that cannot be said for many other actors. He came to us on Dark Shadows with an inevitable task. Thanks to 1897 storyline, Angelique credibly transitioned from unforgivable villain to a clever, brilliantly strategic heroine with a wistfully sad secret. It is probably the most overlooked gem in the crown of that storyline. Soon after, we reunite with her in late 1969 to find her married. Dark Shadows fans are protective of Angelique. What kind of man could possibly satisfy this literal force of nature? Casting the part of her husband may have been one of the most difficult tasks for the producers in the course of the show. The answer again, the Marlboro Man, Hollywood born stuntman, model, and actor Jeffrey Scott. Not just the Marlboro Man, but as the man who walked to the Taj Mahal for a camel. Only a guy like Jeffrey Scott could do that with an easy confidence that made him look right at home. As hunky, magnetic publisher Sky Rumson, Scott was as warmly likable as he was blindly ambitious. When he discovered his true identity as a Leviathan cultist after the headaches caused by the intense and introspective Collins men, it's understandable why Angelique finds this rugged, all-American, hard-working businessman an uncomplicated relief. And it's just as easy to feel her betrayal when his occult affiliation surfaces. Laura Parker and Jeffrey Scott had an easy chemistry, and that's understandable. Both appeared with Dan Hedaya in the Broadway musical Lulu and made a darn good looking couple. Scott went on to be in constant demand for commercials, television, and film. A frequent guest star on programs like Matt Houston, Harry O, and Dynasty. He was no stranger to comedy, also appearing on Married with Children. He was a lead as well, starring in innovative NBC program Cliffhangers with Jerry Reed in A Concrete Cowboy, taking over in a role originated by Tom Selleck, and in one of the first made for cable series, First and Ten. The latter was a role he won out from competing actor Chris Pennock. No hard feelings, he was simply made for it. Like John Beck, Jeffrey Scott was the kind of star who refused to be taken down by the bullet of a fashionable irony that pursued the unique American institution known as the square jawed leading man. There was, and we hope always will be, a demand for actors of the honest and knowing strength, emphasized by Mr. Scott. His career began on Dark Shadows, and as one of its alums, he made the show proud by continuing to evolve as a hard working and welcome presence across the spectrum of performance. His final film role was as the president in 2003's Hulk. He had my vote. He did. Great actor, by the way. Really, really great actor. All right, guys, I'm going to stop right there. When I come back, I'm going to pick up chapter 5 with episode 960. I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.